Kant Sellars Conference, Day 1, Talk 3, Thomas Latt.
Alles sagen, was du sagen wolltest. And now you have to change. And that's a form of
These are the constraints. You have to be facing this way and choose a tree now, which is not a complete different scale of anything else. First of all, others mad on the side. That was a quote, like 2 villages or whatever it is. For a good reason. Like we would have helped it so much better than these.
Welcome to the peanut gallery.
I mean, it could have been having better.
So in your how many
my lifetime. Yeah. Greatest.
Okay, so go to control panel, and you can just shut off sound altogether.
Okay. Back off.
Yeah, you should drag that down the bottom and then
Which has to be like picked up at the time.
well, this one
First year was good. It's in like 40 million. This is not for It was one of many.
So, welcome to the last session today. We will discuss Thomas Mann's paper, Intuition and Productive Imagination.
Thank you.
I kind of thought I'd ask this question first because it's
I think Thomas wants to say something.
Jump that gun.
Forget about it, Thomas.
I call on you because I thought you were going to make some conversation anymore.
Yes, I think Thomas should speak first.
Yeah, I would like to say a few things. Thank you. And so the topic is what role Kant's doctrine of the productive imagination might play in his theory of intuition. And that's a topic that's very prominent in Sellars, but I didn't say anything about Sellars here. So I thought I might just say some very brief things about that in these remarks. I mean, my original idea was to kind of think through this by way of engaging Sellars, but I then decided I first had to just get clear on what I think about the topic in Kant, and then there was enough. And still, as it is, it's very programmatic and sketchy. But let me say the following about Sellars, and then just maybe give a brief summary of the paper. So Sellars thinks, unlike some other Kant commentators, that intuitions have objective purport, representations of objects, in the intentional sense. of all, and that their status as having objective purport depends on some kind of involvement of spontaneity, right? Or another way of putting that the unity of intuition is at some level of description categorical unity. And so that's an account of Sellars' view of intuition that I'm very sympathetic to, that I also would like to defend. So as far as that goes, I'm sort of on the same page. So what I just said is an expression of what I call in the paper the spontaneity thesis that Kant holds. Also, like I think Sellars holds, I believe that we should think of an intuition as a different type of representation from a judgment. This is maybe slightly tricky to characterize, but the basic idea is that it's one thing to have an intuition, an object. It's another thing to make a judgment. The one doesn't entail that you also do the other. And there are some or quite a few commentators who don't share that view, who think that insofar as an intuition is the representation of an object, insofar as that characterization of intuition is adequate, there is judgment. So you cannot have one without the other. So Strawson, I think, thinks that. I think Robert Pippin used to think that. And a whole bunch of other people. Now, if that second claim, which in the paper I call Conceptualism, if that's right, then there's a prima facie problem, namely, it's hard to see how both the spontaneity thesis and the heterogeneity thesis could be true together, because Kant seems to tie the exercise of spontaneity, or equivalently for my purposes, the use of concepts, to the idea of judgment. So, in a way, that seems to suggest that wherever you have concept use or act of spontaneity, you have judgment. And so if that were right, then obviously there would not be intuition as a distinct kind of representation or mental state from judgment that is nonetheless spontaneity dependent in this kind of way. And in this kind of recent and still ongoing debate about whether Kant is a so-called conceptualist about intuition, about conceptual content, this kind of shows up. One side of this debate, the people that usually figure in this debate as the way of conceptualists, they're very impressed by the spontaneity thesis and take this to imply that there cannot be objective purport without judgment. And the other side, the non-conceptualists, are impressed by the heterogeneity thesis and take this to imply the negation of the spontaneity thesis. That, in their case anyway, there can be objective purport that's wholly independent of spontaneity concepts and so on and so forth. And that's what intuition is. But that's just one, that debate is just one manifestation of this general problem. It's not limited to that particular debate, I think. But it's a useful way of setting it up, I think. So then the question is, what could it be for something to be an exercise or act of spontaneity that does not consist in a judgment? And so just the starting point for the paper as well, Kant says some intriguing things about a capacity he calls the productive imagination, and they seem to fit the bill. Namely, he says that the productive imagination is spontaneous, but is also somehow sensible. And so here we have the two relevant characteristics. But the problem then is to see, well, how could that be so? How can we make sense of an act of spontaneity that is sensible in the way the product of imagination is supposed to be? And so then the idea for the paper is to see if one can make sense of the idea that the notion of spontaneity, or as I usually say in the paper, of concept use, but in a way how one uses terminology doesn't matter, is in some sense wider than the notion of judgment. Not in the sense that it's wholly independent of the notion of judgment, but in the sense that it allows for a kind of exercise of spontaneity that does not consist in acts of judging. And I think that's something that Sellars actually holds as well. I mean, maybe that's not entirely clear, but it seems that when he so famously characterizes the form of intuition as a this such, as this kind of demonstrative total concept combination, when he characterizes it in that way, he says that this kind of structure does not exhibit predicative form as judgments do for Kant, although it's not unrelated to predication, but it does not itself exhibit predicative structure, and it is therefore not a judgment. So Sellars too seems to recognize this kind of involvement of spontaneity in acts of the mind that are not judgments. He also thinks that on account of this structure, intuition has categorical unity. Again, that's something that I want, that intuition has categorical unity. And furthermore, he says that, well, Kant's doctrine of the productive imagination is central to that account of intuition. Again, that's something that I agree with, but then the way Sellars spells that out, I'm less sure about, and not maybe so much because I have some very determined objections to that, as that I'm just not sure exactly how it's supposed to work. I mean, in Sellars, there seem to be two components to this account of the involvement of the productive imagination in intuition. On the one hand, there are these peculiar kinds of concepts that he indicates by his use of this such phrase. On the other hand, there's what he calls the construction of image models under the guidance of a sort of bit in the concept, or of these concepts anyway. And I mean, perhaps that's the way to go ultimately. I don't know. I don't take a stand on that in this paper, and I'm not really sure what to think. I'm approaching the topic from a slightly different angle. And the central idea there is that, well, since Kant, employs this matter-form terminology all over the place, and distinguishes in particular between the form of sensibility and sensible matter, and correlatively between the form of intellectual representation and its matter, a promising route might be to attend to the characterizations of the form in each case, and then one might be able, the hope is, to sketch and ultimately fully develop an account of what it might be for spontaneity to be exercised in such a way that the representations that it accounts for bear sort of sensible form. For instance, in this debate about conceptualism, concepts are often characterized as playing primarily or perhaps exhaustively a classificatory role for Kant. That in using concepts, you classify things as being of a certain sort. And this is then even applied sometimes to how Kant thinks about categorical concepts, that what it means to apply or to use the categories is to represent something as an object. And it seems that when you approach the issue that way, it's very natural to think that judgment is the only context in which concepts, and therefore spontaneity, have a place for Kant. And Sellars already, I think, makes the case that that's not the only role for concepts in Kant. That concepts and spontaneity find application in making objects available for classification. That's one way I think of describing the presentational function of intuition. So anyway, the structure of the paper then is that I first draw a distinction, which I don't defend here, but just present as an assumption that I'm working with, the distinction between, on the one hand, intuitions and concepts, both conceived as representations that involve a collaboration between understanding and sensibility. And then on the other hand, so what I call understanding as such and sensibility as such. Where the idea is that, well, here we can get a grip on the contribution that these two faculties make to the joint product. I then proceed to sketch an account of what the contribution of spontaneity as such is and of sensibility as such, and I do that in a way, or anyway I try to do this in a way that yields a characterization of spontaneity as such that possesses the kind of independence from judgment that I characterized earlier. And then putting these materials together, I characterize judgment as a certain way of exercising spontaneity, and then characterize the active and productive imagination, which I here label sensible synthesis, as an exercise of spontaneity that takes a specifically different form. A form, namely, in which what I earlier characterized as the contribution of sensibility as such is essential. This is all quite sketchy and preliminary, and a more developed account would have to make it a lot more precise. And I'm also not fully sure I understand all of these bits. So I'm hoping that I can learn something in this discussion. But the account of the contribution of spontaneity as such that I go on to give, in very rough outline, portrays spontaneity as a self-determining capacity for the representation of synthetic unity. That's what I say, and I say a little bit about what I mean by that. Not nearly enough, but anyway, that's the idea. Central to this is the idea that Kant recognizes what I call the generic representation of synthetic unity. I appeal to the pure principles as giving us a grip on this notion of synthetic unity. And furthermore, he seems to think that this generic representation of synthetic unity is in some way implicated or involved in determinate exercises of spontaneity. Exercises that are, have more determinate content than the generic representation of synthetic unity. The account of sensibility as such that I give makes a lot of this notion I call, borrowing from Daniel Sutherland, who I think has left, what I call strict logical homogeneity. The idea here is that a manifold is strictly logically homogeneous if its parts are qualitatively identical and yet numerically distinct. And I try to suggest that this is something that Kant thinks is true of the forms of sensibility of space and time. I talk only about space. And that he thinks, furthermore, is something that is, in some crucial sense, non-conceptual. So then, appealing to this idea, I argue that we can distinguish between two kinds of exercise of spontaneity that are distinguished by the characteristic structure that they exhibit. The first is judgment, unsurprisingly, whose structure is predicative for Kant. And the second is sensible synthesis, the act of the productive imagination. And sensible synthesis exhibits a structure that essentially involves this notion of strict logical homogeneity. I then say a little bit about the category of magnitude in this connection, which I think is tied to this notion of strict logical homogeneity. Anyway, I should maybe come to that now. So there's some very hand-wavy remarks at the very end of the elocution that Kant employs when he talks about the idea that the understanding determines sensibility a priori. I say something very sketchy there that picks up on something I read in the paper of Steve's. Well, maybe we can get to that later. But so, anyway, that's the basic idea. As I said, it's quite rough, but there it is.
Okay, now Jim.
No, I've gotten lost thinking about what Thomas said. Well, I was just going to ask one question about terminology to start us off. Partly because to ask interesting questions, I want to make sure I understood your terminology, so I could ask you questions easier. So, I guess I have two terminological questions. One is about concept, conceptual and non-conceptual. And the other is about sensibility as such.
Mm-hmm.
But, so, in footnote 7, you point out that, there's different ways to use the concept. I'm talking about Kant. And you say, this is how I'm going to regiment the terminology I've been using. So when we have sensible synthesis, we can speak of concepts as spontaneity, the actually to a concept. That we have categorical unity. That doesn't commit us to the idea that we have something that's a predicate of a judgment, not a predicate of a role. Mm-hmm. So you say, in this way of using the terminology, that any act of spontaneity is an active representation through concepts in this very general way of employing the term, or very inclusive or capacious way of employing the term concepts. This includes acts of the productive imagination. And then you point out, one might use a different regimentation and reserve talk of concept application for judgment. In that case, one could not equate spontaneity with the power to represent the concepts. You say nothing rides in the choice of regimentation. So there's just two ways we could talk here. One is we could give judgment concept away to the nexus of judgment and speak of the forms of unity that are tied to spontaneity in the categories here in such a way that we don't use the term concept and kind of ignore the fact that Kant calls the categories pure concepts. Or we could speak the other way and have this more capacious use of concept, in which only one way of using concepts then would be to combine them with judgments. But later on in the paper, what is and is not essentially non-conceptual is a really huge topic. So about your characterization of the form of synthesis that is crucial to sensible synthesis, you want to connect it, as you just said now, with this idea of strict logical homogeneity, and you want to say that kind of synthesis is essentially non-conceptual. A representation exhibiting strict logical homogeneity is essentially non-conceptual. I'm reading. That's how you characterize it. That seems... The only way I could understand that was to use the word conceptual, and therefore understand non-conceptual, in accordance with the second regimentation, which was the one that you were rejecting. So then I could understand how the view held together by deciding that you yourself alternated between regimentations. Yeah. Or the alternative was to think, no, in footnote 7 you say this is the regimentation, this is how it works. But then I wasn't sure exactly what we were saying about this kind of sensible synthesis. So it was just one of these places where I couldn't tell whether I was having a problem with the view or the terminology. I was hoping it was with the terminology, but I wasn't sure. But I wanted to make sure before we talk about the view.
Right, yeah, good.
And I had a similar problem with sensibility as such. I mean, there's exactly parallel problem about how severe an abstraction that involved. But anyway, maybe you should say something about this first.
Yeah, so when I say that sensible synthesis, how do I put it, is or involves?
I'm afraid I copied this in such a way that I lost my page number.
Anyway, when I characterize it as non-conceptual, what I mean is that it involves the representation of a kind of structure that could not be specified purely by conceptual means. So you might say it involves some kind of... It must therefore involve an element that is non-conceptual in the sense that concepts could not account for it.
Concepts understood as predicates of judgment, or because they do involve an act of spontaneity, right?
Yes, but I think involved is crucial. I mean, it couldn't be spontaneity as we're acting on its own. I mean, it depends, I think, on the availability of something other than, well, how Kant characterizes the capacity for concept use. So anything going with spontaneity and concepts would not be sufficient, I think, to have the right kind of structure. So something that cannot be derived from or generated out of spontaneity must be there. But I want this to be compatible.
But the act of spatial representation does, in the first sense of the capacious sense of concept involved, is conceptual in the first representation.
Yes.
Right. I mean, obviously, it involves a material, which His way of putting it. Obviously, the matter itself is not contributed by the concept, but the way you put this, I found not quite confusing, because it looks like the representation exhibiting the logical homogeneity is essentially non-conceptual. That's what you say.
Page 18.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I lost my page numbers.
That's harking back to something you said in section 3.
Yeah, I mean, I just picked a sentence at random. You have a way of using non-conceptual, but I couldn't fit with your regimentation. It runs dry. I just picked one location.
Yeah. So then that's faulty. Then I shouldn't have said that. I mean, I want it to be non-conceptual only in the sense that it must involve this element, that must be contributed by something other than spontaneity.
But the only sense in which the act of representing is not conceptual is in accordance with the second regimentation of the word.
Yes.
Right. Okay, exactly. I think it's almost like the other side of the coin. There's some kind of confusion about sensibility as such and how that works as an abstraction. I mean, how severe an abstraction are we working with when we have in view only what you call sensibility as such? I mean, here's a way of speaking of sensibility as such, which I recognize from the first critique. We distinguish between sensation and intuition. And in doing that, we're considering, the matter of intuition, apart from its being formed, qua the mere matter of intuition. So, sensation, as such, we might say, is a way of considering sensibility as such. That I understand. But your notion of sensibility as such seems to build in more than that. I mean, at one place when you're, this is the second to last page, I think, when you're, talking about B160, and you identify it with the form of intuition. Now, I would have thought we're not going to be able to make sense of the, and I think that's the point of B160, that we're not going to be able to make sense of the form of intuition apart from one of these acts of spontaneity, which is at the heart of your paper. In which case, it seems like a strange thing to identify with sensibility. If the notion of form of intuition presupposes the synthesis, which belongs to the understanding in one of its dimensions. So it seems like a very related problem to the problems. So here, I mean, it's a question about, as such, how large an abstraction does that mark off? I mean, we don't want to say, I think, if I understand your view, that form of intuition involves a notion of form, which does not, which somehow is in place apart from a contribution of spontaneity.
Wow.
or does it? Or is the mere, logical, or the mere sort of logical homogeneity itself all you mean by form? That doesn't seem like enough. It seems like we need a representation of it. Anyhow, that's exactly the same problem.
So that's very tricky. And so, I mean, in that footnote, the famous B160 footnote, Kant seems to distinguish between what he there calls form of intuition and characterized as mere manifoldness, something like that, and formal intuition, which he characterizes as involving unity of the manifold.
I agree there's that distinction, but my question is whether either side of that distinction comes free.
I'll get to it. So what I'm wanting to call the contribution of sensibility as such is this mere manifoldness that he talks about there. And so, under the heading there of form of intuition. Now, that I think that in some sense contributes this strict logical homogeneity. Okay, so now, I think I'm not sure what terminology to use really, but so this is going to be crude. Any actual representing in intuition will involve spontaneity. Okay, but it's a presupposition of the possibility of any act of that kind, that there is this sort of mere manifold, and that's something that is as it were, is there on account of sensibility, but it's something like, a mere potentiality for representation. It's not like.
Isn't the form of those acts of representation? Therefore, the form's going to go with spontaneity of the actual representations. I mean, how are we understanding form here? If we're completely pulling it apart from spontaneity and just putting it in the part side of mere manifolds.
Well,
a form of what?
Of any representation that is sensible. So I think what the character of a representation as sensible in this account depends on its having this character of manifoldness, but any act of enjoying a representation that's sensible must involve some kind of grasp of that structure, and is therefore spontaneity involving. So that's the idea. But we couldn't, as it were, get that structure itself out of spontaneity. So
I agree. This is where the notion of form goes. perspective of distinction. You seem to be trying to attach the form to the matter as something that just belongs to the matter itself.
That's what he's doing.
And that seems to drain the notion of form balance.
Isn't that right, Thomas? The form of intuition on your reading is not a form of representation. It's a form of potential representation.
Yes.
And for there to be actual representation, there needs to be more than that form.
Right. Yes.
But that form contributes a potential for representation. I'm looking at a sentence of yours on this. So it isn't the second to last; it's the third to last page. But Jim's questions to you seem to presuppose that what you would have to be taking Kant to mean by a form of intuition in the footnote is a form of representation, and then it's really puzzling what sensibility as such doing here, because you don't have representation unless you have more than sensibility at work. But he's exactly giving a story about form of intuition as opposed to formal intuition, on which the presupposition is false. Sorry, Thomas, but isn't that right?
That's clearer than I was.
Well, you've got a lovely clear sentence.
I knew that was a possible reading. I mean, I think potentiality for representation could be understood in different ways. You could think,
it's kind of important that if that's what you've got, you haven't got representation yet. You haven't got actual representation yet. And then that's what fixes it.
I think one problem, probably related to what Jim suggested, is that it looks like this, like productive imagination or the spontaneity here can determine those very forms.
Yes.
And so determination often in Kant, I would say always, but okay, that's probably something we'll have to argue about. Determination is always a relation between form and matter. And in this sense, those forms of intuition would be, as it were, would serve as the matter of determination through spontaneity. And you seem to try to escape this conclusion by talking about potentialities. But I'm worried that this is a mere verbal solution. Because one cannot make anything of it in a way. And the notion of form of intuition as matter of this determination would of course be very problematic. So that might be a way of
Well, I mean, I think so. I tried to suggest early on in the paper, I think that seems to me there's a use of the word determine that goes with actualization of the capacity, where even the capacity that the receptive has a form, such that its actualizations will, as it were, look a certain way rather than another way. I mean, it can be actualized in certain determinate ways and not just any way. It is, for instance, a capacity to represent spatially, as opposed to Martian form of sensibility or something, or whatever. And so.
And that form it has independent way of spontaneity.
Yes. And so then I want to read the notion of understanding or spontaneity determining sensibility in that sense of determine, where now it's tricky. I mean, so now sensibility does, in that determination, as it were, spontaneity does contribute to the representation of unity. But that is not, that itself is not, is not sensible form, or that is not the, how to put this, it contributes a kind of representation of unity that I think that in some way it could not, spontaneity itself could not or have if it wasn't capable of determining sensibility in this way. So, I mean, the notion of unity is the one of unity of a manifold whose parts are like spatial parts, merely manifold, as it were, qualitatively identical. That's something, I think, the content of that idea, I think, for Kant depends on the possession of the sensible capacity for representation. And so it could therefore not be something that spontaneity somehow contributes on its own. Yeah, go ahead.
No, just on your use of determination. I mean, you introduced it on page 5 in connection with productive imagination, determining sensibility. That's a quite general conception of determination. So I take it, or correct me if I'm wrong, I take it that this is supposed to include cases of, like, it's not only meant to have this, to apply to this case of determination of form, but also to the determination of sensible matter in an intuition. So productive imagination would, as it were, be responsible for the synthesis of sensible manifold in an intuition, not merely of a priori sensible manifold intuition, or only, those are two possibilities, or only of a priori forms of intuition.
Not only.
Not only.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So, while I understand that one would want to redetermine in your special sense in the a priori case, just to get rid of certain problems, I just simply not see that this is a possible reading of what Kant has in mind if he's talking about synthesizing sensible matter in a concrete intuition, not only moment intuition. Maybe in the intuition of space as such, time as such. So that would be a worry about. And furthermore, if this is not would not be a good use of determination, why should there be a different use of determination with respect to form than with respect to matters, and Kant seems to use the same word in those cases. I mean, it's equivocal. So that would be
Okay, good. So let me just ask a clarificatory question. So when you say he uses the word determine with respect to matter and with respect to form, so what exactly do you
use it with respect to those? Whether this is the same sense you're using the word determine. From your introduction of the word determination on page 5, I took it that would have to be the same sense. And I suggested that with respect to empirical intuition, matter in empirical intuition, this doesn't really add up. So
yeah, I mean, so
and then
so I think the exercise or actualization of receptive capacity for representation involves determination by something distinct from it, right? That's something from the outside. So, in empirical intuition, this involves affection by the object, right? So, and in this use of determine, one can then say that sensibility is determined to an empirical intuition by an object. Okay. Now, that determination, or that empirical intuition, that actualization of the capacity, if I'm right in sort of what I say is very roughly at the end, that depends on this determination of sensibility by spontaneity, and so, as it were, inherits the unity, we could say. And so, in that sense, even when we're dealing with empirical intuition, so intuition involving sensible matter, there's a sense in which the relevant determination, although approximately it depends on object, is also in the full story dependent on spontaneity, on a priori determination.
A priori.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. That goes without saying, but there's a different form of determination through spontaneity by means of empirical concepts in play at the same time, isn't there? I mean, that is just, it's really a question of clarification, because it is not only that we have something in spontaneity and on those very general forms, and we have this empirical input or receptivity, and whoops, there is the intuition of a table.
Right.
So we need the concept of a table, and the concept of a table is telling us something about how to synthesize whatever we have here. And this seems to be a determination through or by spontaneity as well. That's my worry here, that those senses of determination somehow. Yeah. But maybe I simply, maybe I don't.
Yeah, I don't want to say that this use of determine that I was talking about is the only use in Kant. There seems to be a very different use, and one way in which it is used, it seems to say is the one that seems to be in play when he talks about appearance as the undetermined object of intuition, which we can determine in judgments, which I take.
I didn't mean that. I just thought, with respect to the activity of the productive imagination, shouldn't be very different activities. That was just me.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. So, I was going to get to what I took you to be saying just a minute ago, which was that maybe there's a story to be told about the pure concepts and how they are involved in the determination of sensibility. But then we also need a story about empirical concepts. And empirical concepts surely are involved in empirical intuition.
My question is productive imagination on your reading of Kant involved in both empirical and determination of this kind and a priori determination of this kind? If so,
yes.
Why not?
Yes.
Yeah, if it is yes, then I still want to know. So there's no use in distinguishing between different uses of determine in Kant with respect to other processes. I simply wanted to. So that would be the.
So I'm actually not sure what to think about the kind of story that Sellars tells. Sellars seems to focus on empirical concepts, or material concepts, let's say, and the way. When he talks about the concept of a cube as functioning as a recipe for constructing an image model.
He has actually both interplay, and both are guided by, somehow invoked by the productive imagination. I didn't want to talk about Sellars, I just want to talk about your conception. And
Well, I'm focusing on categorical concepts. I'm not sure entirely what the story about empirical concepts will be in the end. I'm sure that empirical concepts will have to be thought of as somehow involving, in more determinate ways, the categorical concepts. So, and therefore, the story about empirical concepts must somehow inherit some of the features of the story about categorical concepts. But exactly how it's supposed to go, I'm not sure.
I'll pass on the finger, but could I keep my hand on the...
Sure. But then we first have Stephen.
Okay. I think I'm sympathetic with the spirit of your paper, but I wonder if you could say a bit more about the the way in which concepts get used in this first or second sense of concept that you were distinguishing the
non-judgmental was the first one.
Yeah. I'd just like to know a bit more about what's going on in that use of concepts. Partly because I have in mind, the straightforward statement of Kant's that the understanding can make no use of concepts except be judged by means of them. And that proposition seems to play a crucial role in the paragraph that positions him, he takes it, to identify the basic function of the understanding as consisting in judging, which then, of course, enables him to recover the category functions of thinking and judgment. So it looks as though this proposition, the understanding can do nothing with this concept, can make no use of them except to judge by means of them, is important to him. So I take it you're introducing a sense of concept in which the understanding can use a concept in some sense outside of the judgment. So could you just say a bit about how you're understanding that use and what relation it would have to the concept use in judgment and Kant's proposition that there isn't any other such use?
Yes, good. Yes, that's a great question. So just very roughly, I think that the use of concepts in context other than judgment involves some kind of grasp or understanding of, well, in the case that I'm most concerned with, which is the very high level abstract case, of the kind of representation that we're dealing with. So when I say that the concept of magnitude is exercised or applied in connection with intuition, what I have in mind is that the subject enjoying intuition has some kind of grasp of the character of intuition as being a magnitude, but that grasp does not sort of take the form of, well, making a judgment. This thing, is a magnitude, or something like that. It's some kind of grasp of the general character of representation of this kind, which can be manifested maybe in various sort of indirect ways of assenting or to various propositions that might be put to someone, or maybe in behavior or something like that. I do think that the principle of the axiom of intuition articulates this kind of grasp of the character of intuition as being magnitudes. But one needn't sort of have that sort of explicit grasp of that understanding to count as having it, and so therefore to count as possessing the concept of magnitude and indeed of counting as applying it in connection with intuition. So about the no other use than in judgment objection. So I think that with regard to the text, that particular section where Kant says that is entitled "On the Logical Use of the Understanding." And I think that there's this distinction that Kant draws already in the dissertation between the logical use and the real use of a capacity. And where, I don't know, very roughly, the logical use is characterized as that use involved in having representations of a certain logical structure, say, representation that exhibits a generality characteristic of concepts for Kant. And the real use is characterized as that use on account of which we have pure representations, pure concepts of understanding in this case. And so there's a sort of parallel passage at the opening of the Transcendental Dialectic where he seems to suggest that where you cannot straightforwardly derive the forms of the real use or the capacity from the forms of the logical use. Okay? And so I think that holds in the case of understanding as well, because we seem to have a structure here where we have a genus that has the two pieces of logical use and real use, and unless we have an account of the genus, we cannot get from the one straightforwardly to the other, from the one species to the other species. And so I take the claim that concepts can only be used in judgment to be characterizing the logical use, and so therefore it doesn't, that claim doesn't entail that any use of concepts is in judgment.
So the categories then would be the basic concepts that would jointly constitute the capacity of the understanding so far as its power of a capacity for a real use, to cognize objects. Is that the point?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the use of concepts then in outside the concept of judgment would be the use of categories.
Well,
categorical concepts anyway.
Yeah, like I say, I'm not sure exactly how the story goes about material concepts, but so my story so far is limited to the categorical concepts. Yes.
And are the two uses incompatible with one another, or can they both be co-occurring? Are they such as to exclude one another?
I don't think they exclude one another in the sense that you couldn't have both somehow, simultaneously or something. But
accidentally.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
One would think that the capacity of the spontaneous power to secure a unity of representation and intuition would be the very opposite of the categories. Wouldn't that be where the real use is found? And so wouldn't it be by way of the functions which have a use in judgment?
Sorry, so I want to say the understanding has a real use only if the categories can be employed in intuitional synthesis and conceptual synthesis. So the categories are concepts of objects only if that is the case. Now, if it's true that one can enjoy intuitions independently of making a judgment, then there must be some sense in which it's right to say that you can have the one kind of use independently of the other. But that wouldn't be to say that that's somehow something that at the level of capacities could be had in independence from the other.
Robert?
Does that help?
Robert has a finger?
Yeah, I had a finger.
You would?
I had my finger. Just something you said just set off a bell, and I wondered if you'd say it again or gloss it. I mean, the basic point would be it's a rule as strict as no crying in baseball, that there's no grasping in Kant. Grasp the manifold, the pure sensible manifold, as quantitative.
Yeah.
That can't be the right way to say it. What you mean? What does that mean? Grasp the manifold as quantitative.
So, in the first base argument, Kant says that I represent things as outside me and outside one another, and that couldn't be the case unless there was a pure representation of space. Blah blah blah. And I take it that doing that involves a grasp of the structure of space, in the sense that, for instance, I understand that one thing's being in another location from another thing, outside of it, as it were, is sufficient for it being numerically distinct.
Right.
And whatever intrinsic properties it has.
Well, that's sort of because it's located in a position in space, and the way Kant understands that. I don't have to grasp space. I can't grasp space. I mean, just in the sense in which I know when I'm trying to construct a figure in mathematics, and it works or it doesn't. I'm not. What I'm understanding is the constructive possibility that and its possibility and impossibility is explained by the nature of space. But there's no grasp is an intuitive word. It means I see something, or I predicate something, or it can't be that. I mean, the manifold is quantitative.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get that way by applying the concept of quantity to something that doesn't have it. And it doesn't get that way for me by my seeing something I didn't see as quantitative is. I mean, it just is quantitative.
No, I think it is quantitative, and it is understood to be quantitative.
Well, you have to understand
it wouldn't be a sensible representation if it wasn't understood in some very implicit way to be quantitative. That's the idea.
Well, we understand space and spatial relations and spatial possibility by attempting construction. We're talking about just the a priori level, the pure level.
Right.
Right.
I mean, that's one very. That's the kind of most explicit way of understanding.
That's what I'm trying to get at, because there, what happens is either we succeed or we. Now, in some sense, we see whether we succeed or we fail.
Right.
But that's, in a way, parasitic on what's driving the claim to knowledge, which is not originally a grasping; it's a constructing.
Well.
It sounds like a quasi-predicative use, and it doesn't sound like it's jiving with what you want to say. You need something more radical, and not as traditional as grasping. I mean, I'm with you, but I don't think that's the right way to formulate it. I grasp the pure sensible manifold as quantitative.
Well, I mean, that is what I want to say. I mean,
what is that like? Is it like seeing something?
It seems to me in knowing that sensible representations are representations, of objects independent of me, inhabitants of an objective world, at least anyway, if all goes well. I have the relevant. I have what I'm calling it this kind of grasp. Okay, so the idea is that in treating my intuitions as giving me access to an objective world, I manifest the understanding, what I'm calling the grasp of various kinds of structures that representations of an objective world must have.
Okay, I think I've exhausted my fingers.
Right? So and one aspect of that is that the objective world is spatial, and that its spatiality has this character of of sort of manifoldness that's independent of qualitative distinctions. And so, I mean, I can articulate that kind of grasp, and in very sophisticated ways, but to count as possessing it, I think I needn't be able to give that kind of articulation. I needn't be able to say, what kind of structure a representation must exhibit in order to count as a representation of an objective world. But I must manifest this kind of grasp somehow in practice, and for instance, in behaving in such a way that I'm treating an intuition with a certain kind of content as a reason for judging a certain kind of way, or not to judge a certain kind of way. So that's the basic idea.
Michael?
I'd just like to ask some kind of freshman level question, right? Because I'm having great difficulty with this, part whole stuff. I mean, suppose we do have a concept of space. Suppose it's Newtonian absolute space.
Mm-hmm.
Why does Kant say it can't contain within itself? I mean, it doesn't contain within itself an infinity of representations. It's just part of the concept that you can split it up into indefinitely many regions. But the regions, of course, they would have to be represented if you wanted to delineate them, perhaps by imposing a coordinate system. But they're just regions. They're not themselves representations. They're things that we can represent. If we impose a coordinate system on space, we can represent them. But they're not themselves representations. So the idea that the concept of space space can't be represented by a concept, but must be an intuition, because it can't have an infinite number of representations under it. Well, it doesn't. It's a representation of something that can be split into an infinite number of regions, but regions aren't representations. They're just places to be. I mean, and then the idea that we can't. It seems to me that Kant's Newtonianism is on display here. There's a perfectly good sense in which we can have represent different spaces. I mean, we do now. There's Euclidean space, there's Riemannian space, and there's questions of which space we're in. I mean, depending on how physics goes and so forth. So, I just wondered, are we seeing some historical limitation of Kant's thinking here, that he's really looking into the kind of epistemology and metaphysics of the Newtonian world or something, and that it's not on the horizon for him that there could be radically distinct concepts of space, each of which would be single, of course, in that sense, but they'd have very different geometrical structures and properties. With respect to what the geodesics are and so forth. So I'm just not getting this, whether this argument really is one that should appeal to us still or not. Kant's argument.
Yeah. No, I don't think it should.
Oh.
The claim about this, why, for Kant, the representation of what I'm calling strict logical homogeneity must be non-conceptual, cannot be represented by conceptual means, is based on a very specific conception of what concepts are, right? And that the I mean,
but here's my freshman question: didn't you just represent it conceptually yourself?
He's not denying that we have a concept of space. But our primary representation of space is not conceptual; it is intuitive.
Primary meaning what here? What does primary mean? That's what I'm not feeling.
What it means is that that means
that's the freshman question. What's primary mean then?
That we couldn't have concepts of space unless we had this other thing. That the content of any spatial concept is the content of something that exhibits this kind of structure that we couldn't represent purely by conceptual means. On Kant's conception of concept.
Given that there's different geometrical structures to different spaces. Which is the structure that we couldn't have? I mean, is there some kind of intuition which is independent of all, as it were, specific geometries or something? Is that the thought?
No, it's a conceptual claim. Instances of a concept are not parts of the concept.
Well, I know that,
and there's only one.
But
so it's an intuition.
I'm not claiming that space is a concept. No one's claiming that. It's a question of what's our primary representation of space.
Intuitive, because there's one of it, and its parts are parts.
And why does that follow that it's intuitive?
Because
why can't there be a concept that necessarily has a unique?
Because singular intuition, because intuitions are singular intuitions that are immediate, and that's the relationship we have to space, the space in which we live and have our being.
It's not an assumption.
One of them, and
four metaphysical explanations.
But I don't get them. They seem to be. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding. It seems to me that there's some back and forward between, regions of space, as if they were themselves representations. And so, since there's infinitely many of them, they couldn't fall under a concept. That's what the fourth argument seems to say, because concepts can't have infinite number of representations. But that's just saying, who said that the regions of space were representations? Nobody.
We represent space as having an infinite number of regions within it, all simultaneously. So that space is in that sense, as it were, even though we don't represent it in its infinite complexity at once, we represent it as infinite.
Why is that conceptual?
Well, he has some things to say about the finitude of conceptual representation.
You are arguing, Bill, that if something's necessarily unique, right, then the primary representation must be intuitive because there's only one of them. Is that the argument?
No, it's the instances.
No, this is Bill's argument. He seemed to have to be intuitive because there's only one space. Why can't there be a concept of something? It's part of the concept that there's only one of them and could only be one of them.
So for Kant, Kant operates with a very, you might say, limited conception of conceptual content, of what a concept is. And he thinks that the content of a concept must be understood as basically fitting this kind of genus and specific difference definition, it's a traditional theory of definition. So, think of a kind of taxonomy in this kind of tree-like structure where you have genera and species. He thinks that the content of a concept must be representable to that kind of structure, where I can represent sort of multiplicity, several members of a genus only by distinguishing between qualitatively different species under it, right? Namely by thinking of some of the extensions of the genus as exhibiting one kind of characteristic, and other members of the extension of the genus as not having that characteristic. And on that kind of conception, I couldn't represent mere numerical diversity. I could only represent numerical diversity by means of representing qualitative diversity.
So, suppose I represent a line as a set of points satisfying a linear equation. What am I doing? That sounds pretty conceptual to me.
Well, not for Kant. For Kant,
I mean,
what makes that spatial is only the
you can represent it that way because, of course, you can conceptualize space. He's not saying we don't have a concept of space. He's not saying we can't conceptualize space. He's saying that fundamentally our basic relation to space is intuitive, right? You represent a line primarily by drawing one. If you then later learn how to algebraicize that and represent it as a linear equation, well, fine. But let's face it, you started out learning how to draw lines.
And that equation employs tools that Kant would not regard as conceptual. I mean, quantification, nested quantification presumably.
So that's like a logical play that you just made. Because that doesn't sound right to me. As a matter of fact, I think I don't think in that sense our primordial relation to space is intuitive in the way you're saying. I think it's much more, our primordial relation to space is much more the sort of thing Heidegger describes. I mean, moving around with concernful, relation to...
But what's this got to do with uniqueness?
I mean,
I didn't get that part at all.
I mean, the concept-intuition distinction there strikes me as weird.
Kant's definition of an intuition is that it's not unique, it's individual and immediate, right? A singular and immediate. I don't know where the uniqueness came from.
I just thought you were saying that because it was unique...
That's what I thought.
No, I don't think I said that.
That's what I thought you said.
Okay, because then I was going to say, my mother, there's a concept.
No,
it's necessarily unique, I take it.
That was not.
Okay, good. Glad I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Well, not if I don't know who she is.
That's true.
I wonder who my mother is. Because I know there's only one.
Maybe we should stop this discussion now and go to the next 10, which is mess.
Okay.
Well,
I wanted to express agreement with you, first of all. In contrast, it seemed like some of the earlier discussion, it seems to me there's a very strong textual case for the idea that there are two modes of combination, one of which is judgment and another an act of spontaneity. But now I hear that in the same function passage that we all know by heart, for one thing, the same function that gives unity to various representations in a judgment also, and apparently this is something else, gives unity to the mere synthesis of manifold representations in intuition. Is that something like that? And similarly, in section 15, the reader reiterates it, right? I mean, he says all combination. All combination. Whether it is a combination of the manifold of intuition or of several concepts. The latter sounds like combination in a judgment. The former sounds like something else. The thing Thomas is talking about. So anyway, so I feel very sympathetic to that idea, but I was accepting it. I wanted to ask a question of Sellarsian in spirit or something, which is so you make a case that the unity that constitutes an intuition is something heterogeneous with respect to concepts. And then I can start to feel rising in me, this question, how does intuition support, make sound, ground, say, I don't know what, a certain act of judging? Right? How is there anything that you can say to clarify for us, and maybe connect with this question about the way in which concepts might be at work in the constitution of the unity of an intuition? Anything you can say about the way in which this heterogeneity is such that it doesn't rule out an intuition founding a right way to judge?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, you just quoted that famous sentence, and I mean, in some sense, the answer would be then, well, categorical unity. I mean, it's not right. It's not completely heterogeneous.
Can you say more?
I just want to make sure that was the question. Yeah. Yeah, so the idea is that even though the structure of sensible representation is heterogeneous in the sense that it exhibits this kind of manifoldness, it is at the same time grasped as a structure that falls under the pure principles of understanding, so that is grasped as the objective in virtue of exhibiting not just this kind of spatial manifoldness, but then also certain causal structure. And so on and so forth. So,
you're using the grasped as locution as Robert was finding provocative, and I guess maybe I am too. I mean, it's not that I have any definite objection, except that I feel like I don't yet fully understand what grasp. Right, yes. So I don't know, what is this like? Somehow drawing the line is I suppose a paradigm of sensible synthesis.
Yeah.
And in what way does there's a concept, a categorical concept, I suppose, give unity to that act of synthesis, and in what way does the presence of that concept in giving unity make judgments about lines possible, I suppose? I don't know. Could we talk about a case or something?
Yeah, so in the line case, I take it that if spontaneity was not in the picture, then there would be only sort of, momentary affections or something of consciousness, and any succession of those kinds of things would never amount to the consciousness of the unity of them, something like that, right? So I don't know. In this case, I guess. I guess he has something like an example of this. If as it were, you think of a point moving, and if somehow you weren't able to, as it were, keep track of the movement of the point and keep in consciousness the space already traversed at any given moment, as belonging to the content being represented, then you wouldn't be representing a line, right? And so, what the category contributes, I think, is the unity of that, so that the consciousness is of all the sort of bits of space traversed by the moving point together, or something like that. So that's the. I think and somehow this must be something present at every kind of. He thinks of this somehow in temporal terms, right? I don't claim to fully understand how this works, but so drawing the line is somehow meant to have a temporal dimension, and so then this enables us to say, okay, if sort of at any given point you somehow lost track of what had gone on before, then you wouldn't be representing this here now as part of the same thing as what came before. So it would just be this here now, or something like that. And so what the category then contributes is some kind of consciousness that what's going on now is part of the same act of representing as what came before. That's the.
We have two fingers, Jim, and then Stephen.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I was just, it's related to this, just trying to figure out some of the dialectical situation with conceptualism. And so when you have the Sellarsian thing about this cube, this such, this line, then his idea was that intuitions are singular conceptual representations. Right. And then there's the passage about the only use of concepts is to judge by means of them.
Right.
Now you have strong conceptualism, very strong. It's that it's only in judgment. I forget the definition of it. Mm-hmm. But there's an aspect of Sellars. This part of it could be conceptualist in a sense that most non-conceptualists are averse to, which says this cube is a singular intuition, but it's conceptualized, and then also the role of the concept wouldn't be what it is unless that concept had a general role to play in judgment. Mm-hmm. But you're not judging necessarily, and just taking in this cube and so on. And then the thing about the homogeneity, if you grant that you know how some non-conceptualists want to say sort of objects are given to us. Kant says objects would still be presented to us even if we didn't. But they want to make a lot of they want to get a lot of mileage out of that and say you've got particularity present or whatever. Whereas your reading is again on the conceptualist side of those general debates. Even if there is this other logical homogeneity, I mean, it's still, insofar as you're intuiting this cube, it involves conceptual apprehension in a way that wouldn't be what it is unless there was a role in judgment. So a lot of it looks like it's consistent with the full spirit of conceptualism, other than this very strong definition of strong conceptualism that doesn't distinguish between that kind of sub-judgment role of a concept. So it looked like everything was conceptualist.
Yes.
And that the real things that animate some of the non-conceptualists and the other side of Sellars, which is this sense impression stuff, you're not really... Your paper harmonizes and says, I can take what's good from non-conceptualism and from conceptualism, but really it's a defense of conceptualism other than this strong judgmental.
Weak conceptualism.
But in the actual dialectics of the debate, non-conceptual,
they wouldn't accept.
Yeah, no, I mean that's right.
Sinner or saint.
Right.
That's right, but I take it that the conceptualist side is very often portrayed as being this very strong version of conceptualism, and only that somehow any commitment to conceptualism would be something like that, the very strong form, and that's then what objections are mounted against, and so. Yeah,
I guess I'm familiar with the sort of Sellars and some of the John McDowell and some of the, which may have been the kind of, it's that they would want to grant that you have. They want to agree with both. There's a role for conceptualization that's not just judging, but that wouldn't be the role that it is without an essential connection to judging. Was most of what I was familiar with as conceptualism.
Yeah, I mean that's fine with me. But I mean.
So your thing about logical homogeneity doesn't really doesn't save most of the things that Hannah and Allays and all these people, I'm not an expert on this debate, but people who go hard on the non-conceptual side, and what Sellars said Kant should have had is this other non-conceptual side. A conceptualist can be happy sort of with what you have. You don't really traffic quite in what they want.
No, I mean, if we draw the following two distinctions. So on the one hand, we can distinguish between intuitions, conceptual experience, and judgment, and we can point out that there are structural differences between these. And then on the other hand, we can distinguish between the capacity to have one kind of representation, the capacity to have the other kind of representation. I think the non-conceptualists think that you can have the one kind of capacity in complete independence from the other kind of capacity, right? So you could have sensibility or the capacity for perceptual experience, whatever you want to call it, without possessing the capacity for conceptual thought. And still, sensibility would be a capacity to represent objectively. So I want to object to that, and so to the extent that I do that, I'm a conceptualist, or this view is conceptualist. Yes. But I want that to be compatible with agreeing that you don't have to go in for this very strong form of conceptualism. Right. You can recognize that there's an important difference in structure between intuition and judgment. But that doesn't force you to go non-conceptualist. So that's the idea. Also, it seems that if you want that kind of view, then you need to give an account of how it can be that you can have that the capacity to have intuitions which are not judgments, and is nonetheless dependent on the capacity to make judgments. So is spontaneity involving, or spontaneity dependent? Yeah. So on what's the story that explains why that is so? And so at least the way Kant sets it up, it seems that his answer to that question is, well, some spontaneity is somehow implicated in exercise of sensibility itself. And so then this was an attempt to locate sort of the elements of that kind of story in the text.
So now we have, I think, finger by Stephen, but I think it was concerning rather Matt's question.
It was back to Matt, but actually Bill's finger was...
and then afterwards we have a finger of Jim, and then a finger of Robert.
My finger is for that one, so if you're for the back,
I have a completely independent finger.
Yours.
I'll throw in a finger. Oh, no, I had a hand, but I had a hand, but I'll also get a finger at the end of this.
So we have...
I have mine is
Starting to suspect that
Way to go now.
So we have Stephen's finger, Jim's finger, Robert's finger, Araka's finger, and Karen's finger. But then we should, because Bill raised his hand at the very beginning of the session, so at least...
Yes, but Jim snuck in a finger to steal my thunder by asking the question. I was going to make a hand.
Your hand, yeah.
Yeah, so it's fine. It's okay.
Really snuck in a finger.
You can grasp with just
right. What Jim can do in a finger, I take a whole hand.
So we start with Stephen.
I think this is probably quick. In a way, this goes back to my first question as well. Your response to the most recent fingers encouraged me to think that you don't really need to distinguish between these two uses. I'm not confident that you really need to draw a distinction between two uses in any really strong sense, because I don't like that idea. I want cognition to be judgment. It's discursive cognition we're talking about. But when I think about the way Kant uses that brought up the example of the drawing of a line. Kant, the first place like occurs, I think, is that right? In 17, he says, in order to know anything in space, I must draw it. Yeah. So
thus generate.
Exactly. So the use of the concept line that figures in the giving of unity to intuition of the line is in the service of knowing something, knowing about something in space, in this case the line. So it's a use of a concept that's on the way to a judgment. It's the subject concept of a judgment that he's talking about. And so it's really in the context, anyway, of a judgment that this use of the concept is to be found. So since we are talking about the cognitive power, everything it does must be cognition, or in the service of cognition, mustn't it? So wouldn't this use of concepts that you're speaking of, unity of mind, be something that we could understand always in the environment of judging activity? Anyway, I wanted to see whether that would be okay with you.
Well, okay, so the cues to use were like on the way to and in the environment of. So,
in order to know,
the
understanding wants to know.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's in the business of knowing.
Yes.
We could use that.
Right, and sensibility furnishes it with materials for that, and so it's insofar as sensibility has that role that we need this other use of concepts. I'm saying so. That is in the environment of knowing, but it's I want to say not the same thing as judging that as F.
That's understood, but
so
I just want to keep the connection.
You want something tighter, I think, than
that it was coming to be.
Close the door. How's that in the service of knowing?
That's a practical use. That's not a theoretical use.
But it's a concept. It's got concepts
We're really talking
in it.
about the theoretical use of concepts in this discussion.
Well, he said every exercise. I thought the question was whether every exercise of sensibility, every exercise of concepts was in a judgment, and I just don't even understand how anyone could even entertain that view. Because entertaining.
I'm talking about the theoretical case only.
Theoretical use of the.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
He makes distinctions. He doesn't always.
The theoretical use means knowledge, so it's virtually a tautology.
Yeah, I was going to say.
You get a lot of things.
So Jim?
Yeah, so this is off of your exchange with the other Jim. But Jim was trying to locate you in this debate between non-conceptualists and conceptualists. And we had a somewhat typical, and I think for certain purposes we might want to go beyond course kind of characterization of what the options were. So there's the typical sort of non-conceptualists, and they have a way of representing what the conceptualists are committed to that looks a bit mad dog. And then one can point out there's room for, and you're rejecting their representation of the alternatives, and there's room for a kind of weak conceptualism in which one's insisting that spontaneity is in act in the constitution of intuitions, without buying into that, but while rejecting the non-conceptualism. And if that's just the only way one has to locate the options, then it's sort of clear Thomas will be situated, in this paper too, as a weak conceptualist. But it seemed to me the details of your view were sort of involve, positioning yourself actually with a position that looks a little different to me from the standard positions, in which you were sort of, at least I don't know how to put it, a half step closer to the other non-conceptualists than most weak conceptualists are. I mean, here's a kind of issue that gets, framed in these debates. The non-conceptualists, the typical ones, will want to say something like, the doctrine of sensibility, the aesthetic, is completely self-standing. And the doctrine of our forms of intuition is therefore completely self-standing. It has nothing to do with the doctrine of the forms of sensibility. You want to deny that. They're not just completely self-standing. But one way of denying that, but then the details of how one denies that could involve someone being very sympathetic to your idea that we distinguish between something like judgmental synthesis and sensible synthesis. But hold not only that the representation of any unity involves the categories, but that that unity or form, itself, has to do with the way in which the understanding is in some way or other enact in the exercise of our cognitive capacity relative to sensibility, and so have many of your distinctions, but still want to understand a form-matter distinction as always in some sense reflecting our spontaneous capacity, as Steve was calling it in the last session. And then one could distinguish the way that spontaneous capacity is enacted in sensible synthesis and intellectual synthesis, so that one could make sense of the difference between things being in space as opposed to being brought under a concept. Mm-hmm. But you wanted to go a step further and say, no, there's a notion, as I understand what you were saying in our early exchange, there's a notion of form of intuition, where that notion of form or unity really belongs to sensibility as such. And it might be true that its representation, as a unity requires the spontaneous capacity. But there is a notion of form that belongs to sensibility as such. And qua the form of that faculty, the sensible faculty, can be grasped as standing in a form-matter relation. There's a form-matter relation internal to sensibility as such, which we can completely grasp apart from, its determination by spontaneous sensibility. Is that right? If that's right, then it does seem to me, though, in terms of Jim's larger roadmap, you're much closer to the weak conceptualists than the non-conceptualists. You're still carving out a different position in which there's something which gives a very different kind of sense to what they want to say about form of intuition than they would, but still allows for the idea that there is a form-matter distinction to be drawn on the side of sensibility as such, which completely grasps it apart from sensibility's relation to understanding. And that would move you, I think, a step closer to them than I understand John's position to be, for instance.
Well, I mean... So I take it's certainly for the purposes of this paper, I mean, the non-conceptualist position is one that holds that sensible representation is intelligible, fully intelligible, completely independently of it.
That's clearly not your position.
Right, yeah, so, but I think that this I mean, but that matters, I think, for adjudicating sort of how close I am to
no, I mean, I agree. I mean, here they are, I'm just moving you like 1/4 of an inch this way. I'm just saying you have a different position. We haven't got out the differences here. You're not just giving arguments that totally line you up on one side of the debate or on the other. You're carving out a slightly different position here, which locates you slightly different, I think. But I agree. I mean, in terms of relative proximity here. Jim had it roughly right. If the helicopter's high enough, that's what we'll say, is what Jim said. But it does seem to me there's this wrinkle in your position now, which makes it not just arguments on one of those two sides to say whether that side's right, but but involves actually changing the shape of one of the two fronts, just like in a particular way.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I was, it's possible that this use of form matter here is not defensible in the end. But I mean, I was trying to use it in such a way that the characteristic that all intuitions, all possible intuitions necessarily exhibit qua intuitions is this type of manifoldness that is not contributed by spontaneity. Right? So in that sense, it is sort of purely sensible form. Okay? It's something that, on account that is exhibited by all possible intuitions, and that makes them distinct in kind from conceptual representation. I mean, from general representation, quite general representation. I also want to say at the same time that any actualization of the capacity that is described in that way involves spontaneity. So, so if that's true, then you cannot understand that capacity independently from its collaboration with spontaneity. You can't even understand the idea that there is this form of sensibility in the sense I was using it, independently of spontaneity, if sensibility is understood there as capacity for representation.
Sorry, so now we have 15 minutes and we have 4 fingers and 4 hands. That won't happen, but maybe we should
speed up.
Yeah, speed up. So the next is Robert's finger.
Okay, I'll try to be very quick. This is just a very general question. Would you regard this as a sympathetic characterization, or would you regard it as hostile to what you're trying to do? Suppose we remind ourselves that acts of thinking don't get to be acts of thinking by a thinker applying the rules of thought to thinking. Thinking is embodying the rules of thought. Mm-hmm. And then the suggestion would be some of the problems are being created by Kant's own language of applying the category quantity to the pure sensible manifold, or going from not grasping that the magnitude is quantitative to grasping that it's quantitative. These kind of separations that then require, there is, the other way of thinking about it would be that, once the sculptor makes the statue and the statue embodies a form, there are not two things. There's one thing. Yeah. They're not two elements. It's crucial to Aristotle. There's only one thing. Looked at from one point of view, looked at from the other. And so the suggestion would be, and this would be a question like, do you agree with this, or do you really want to keep the concepts of application, grasping? Because one could say, coming to understand that the magnitude of pure sensible intuition is quantitative is not really the result of applying the category of quantity in any sense at all. And that way of talking is so misleading. It's as misleading as we get to be thinking correctly by applying the rules of thought to our thinking.
Yeah, sympathetic.
Okay.
And I think the language of application is not Kant's actually. It means ours or mine in this case.
Well, even in the case of an empirical concept, when you apply a concept, it's even the separation. All analytic unities presuppose synthetic unity. So even the application requires something like the reflective determination of which concept might be applicable and the determinative judgment of which one fits. They're not separate moments in the determination of the particular. And it's not like we have the particular in which we're then about which we're then contemplating reflectively which concept or determinately whether to apply it. So all of this language separates things that that would be the general spirit of the. Let's go that way.
That I have to say more about.
Okay, Arata.
I want to go back to I think Matt's and Steve's finger. So I think I sort of want to just go in the direction I think that Steve was going in, which is like a worry perhaps that there are like two kinds of unity or two kinds of synthesis or something like that or that what you're calling the synthesis of perfective imagination is somehow to be distinguished from the synthesis that's involved in judgment. Because it's like I seem to be suggesting that like it is that determinate predication, it's predication that would determine an object, would actually require as a moment of it, the possibility of that, which I think the possibility of determining an object in a judgment would require. I think, as a moment of it, something like what you were calling productive imagination, particularly, through the category. You're talking about the category of quantity, but take it through all the categories. And that's an essential moment of judgment. That is, you could not have a determinate predication of an object, without that. And so, like your strategy of sort of trying to understand the sense in which that both are actually understanding by like identifying sort of a common a notion, a sense in which they're both spontaneity, and you could have gone on to specify like a further instances of spontaneity as well, but you didn't.
Referring to form.
But you could. Reflective judgment might be spontaneity, or maybe not, but certainly, practical cognition would be spontaneity, at least spontaneity. It seems like. In any case, like that way of like locating their unity in like a general notion of spontaneity might not be the right way of doing it. It seems like it could just be that there's this one notion of spontaneity that characterizes judgment as self-determining, and productive imagination, because it is, if it's conceived of as an essential moment of judgment, would partake of the self, the character of the sense in which judgment is self-determining, or something like that. And so you wouldn't have, because there's, at least I had difficulty understanding how the notion of spontaneity that you characterize in terms of endorsement, right, and like somehow some necessary connection between endorsement and actuality would carry over to productive imagination, which I know, like you were like trying, I think, heroically to try to follow out the strategy, but if you just try to derive the sense in which we understand that this act of productive imagination is an act of understanding simply from its essential role in judgment, then it seems like you might not have that problem, because I don't know if that I would accept your characterization of spontaneity in terms of the endorsement actuality connection, but at least in the case of judgment, you have this idea of like that it's somehow constituted by some by your thinking that something is to be judged or whatever. But at least I found it difficult to find the analog in the case of productive imagination. To be like in the case of productive imagination, what would it be like to be synthesized? That seems very odd to me.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's I need to be heroic on that point. Yeah, which doesn't sound like a compliment. I think well, my attempt to find that structure on that side is that you're taking the the understanding of what I was calling the grasp of the capacity for intuition that the subject has involves taking it to deliver representation of an objective world, and I think that that looks more like a kind of belief, you might say, or judgment. However, one about the very nature of this capacity, and so I think maybe that's where one could find this endorsement actuality structure. Right, so it's the idea that the representation is grasped as being of a certain sort, having a certain kind of status. That spontaneity understood in that way is found. But your suggestion, I'm not sure I fully understood. It seems that doesn't give me what I want, namely that you could have intuitions that do not consist in or do not and do not involve judgments, in the sense that having an intuition of an F entails judging something to be an F. So I guess I didn't like. It seems to me that when you say that the product of imagination is a moment of judgment, then I'm beginning to worry that I couldn't get that bit.
Well, I mean,
maybe you're saying no, you don't want that.
Well, yeah, no, I'd have to be clear about like moment of judgment. I mean, a moment of, well, I guess not moment of actual judgment, but a moment of the possibility or the capacity to bring judgment to bear on this object, that you're intuiting. So it wouldn't. You're right. I mean, it wouldn't but it would be connected to the not any actual judgment, which you may not make, but just to the capacity to judge.
So I mean, that's something that I want to say, and that my
so that's very good.
But I guess I don't see why that liberates me from having to say the things I'm trying to say.
Why not? I mean, why isn't that what you? Why would you get what you want? I mean, just because intuition is something that needs to be in the picture, if judgment is to be intelligible as being of an objective world, I don't see why that is enough to entitle me to suppose that intuition itself exhibits the kind of unity that. Well, it's intuition.
You need an explanation for.
It's as intuition as synthesized under the categories. That's anyway.
Now we've 4 minutes, and I think the last question.
Mine is short. My word might be grounded in a complete confusion. So, correct me if I'm confused. I'm worried that if you are right, assuming you're right, you can't really preserve the heterogeneity status. So if you're right, and there are two kind of spontaneous syntheses, one judgmental synthesis, one sensible synthesis, as you want to call it. The one of them is governed by the role of concept in judgment. You call it predicative role, you call it general role, you give it all kinds of descriptions. And the other one is governed not by the way concepts work in judgment, but it is still governed by the categories, right? So you're talking about maybe categorical unity, and we try to figure out maybe what that means. And then I worry that you face a dilemma. So the categories here determine the synthesis, right, on your account, it seems to me. But then, in order to keep the heterogeneity status, as I understand you to explain it, either you need to say that the categories are not concepts, or you need to basically, give up the heterogeneity, because you're suggesting sort of a sensible synthesis in which a sensible synthesis that is determined by the categories. But if the categories are concepts, then it's just not clear to me, and they determine this kind of sensible synthesis that determines sort of special, say, character of the representation. Then they seem maybe quite closely related to intuitions. At least, it's going to be very, much harder to explain why Kant, for example, thinks about the one representation concept as general, for example, let's say, and the other representation as singular, or something like that. Seems to me something needs to give up.
Right, so by heterogeneity, I always need to understand two things. That you can have the one without the other, in the sense of you have an intuition of an F without thereby judging something to be an F, and the other way around. And the two kinds of representation exhibit different structures. In one case, you have predicative structure, in the other case, you have magnitude structure. That's what heterogeneity means for the purpose of this. Right?
But you seem to suggest that maybe the sensible synthesis does not have predicative character, and still it exhibits a categorical unity. No, I mean, I thought that's what you say on page 18.
That's meant to be the point.
Right, yeah.
So, and then of course, I mean, the difficult thing is then to say, well, what would have been consistent? And I was trying to get some language out of saying something about what it might be for spontaneity to be involved, and the representation exhibiting categorical unity on account of that, where that then does not entail predicative structure. So that, I mean, that's meant to be the structure.
Yeah, but then just the question is about if the categories are concepts, then how do you preserve something like their difference from the structure of intuition?
So, how do I preserve the difference of the categories from the structure of intuition? I mean, the categories can figure in judgment, is one thing, and their representation of synthetic unity, which must have its ground in spontaneity. Anyway.
We are running out of time.
Yeah.
Let us thank Thomas.
Thank you.
Wondering what's causing the perturbation? So we'll reconvene tomorrow with where, what, from now.
We have dinner plans?
Because it was, everybody to...
Jim, are we going back to the hotel first or not?
He hasn't
We're just going to go straight? Okay, so I need to make sure I take my luggage with me then.
So many people